The summer heat pressed down on the city streets like a heavy blanket. Officer Derek Hayes wiped the sweat from his forehead as he drove his patrol car through the downtown area. It was one of those days when everything felt sticky and uncomfortable, and people seemed more on edge than usual. Derek had been a police officer for 8 years now. He knew these streets well, every corner and every building. He took pride in keeping his area safe, though lately he'd been feeling frustrated with his job. Crime seemed to be getting worse, and he felt like nobody appreciated what he and his fellow officers did every day. As he turned onto Main Street, something caught his eye. A tall black man in an expensive-looking navy suit was standing near the courthouse steps, holding what looked like a camera or phone. The man was taking pictures of the building, walking around it slowly, studying it from different angles. Derek's instincts kicked in immediately. Who takes pictures of government buildings these days? In his experience, people who photographed official buildings were usually up to no good, maybe planning something illegal or looking for security weak spots. He'd seen it before. He pulled his patrol car over to the curb and got out, adjusting his belt and straightening his shoulders. The man didn't seem to notice him approaching at first, too focused on whatever he was doing with his camera. "Excuse me?" Derek called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned to use on the job. "I need to speak with you." The man looked up, and Derek could see he was probably in his 40s, well-groomed, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was clearly not from around here. His clothes were too nice, too big city looking for their small town. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said politely, lowering his phone. His voice was calm and educated, with just a hint of an accent Derek couldn't quite place. "Is there a problem?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Derek replied, stepping closer. "Mind telling me what you're doing here? Why are you taking pictures of the courthouse?" The man seemed surprised by the question. "I'm just documenting the area," he said simply. "It's part of my work." Derek felt his suspicion growing. That was exactly the kind of vague answer guilty people gave when they were trying to hide something. "What kind of work?" he pressed. "You got some ID on you?" "Of course," the man said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. Derek's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, a habit that had been drilled into him during training. You never knew what someone might pull out of their pocket, but it was just a wallet. The man extracted a driver's license and handed it over. Derek looked at it carefully. The name read Anthony Jackson, with an address from Chicago, Illinois. The photo matched and the license looked legitimate. "You're a long way from home, Mr. Jackson," Derek said, still holding on to the ID. "What brings you to our little town?" "Business," Anthony replied. "I'm here for work-related purposes." There was that vague answer again. Derek's frustration started to build. Why couldn't people just give straight answers? "What kind of business?" "Who do you work for?" Anthony hesitated for just a moment, and Derek caught it. That slight pause, that tiny shift in his expression. In Derek's mind, it confirmed his suspicions. This guy was definitely hiding something. "I work in law enforcement," Anthony said finally. "I'm here to familiarize myself with the area." Derek almost laughed out loud. "Law enforcement?" This guy in his fancy suit, taking tourist photos like some kind of investigative reporter. "Really? What department?" "I'd prefer not to discuss the details in public," Anthony said, his tone still respectful but with a slight edge to it now. "I'm sure you understand, that did it." Derek had heard enough excuses and non-answers for one day. The heat, the stress of his job, and his growing irritation with people who thought they were smarter than him all combined into a surge of anger. "Listen here," Derek said, stepping even closer, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't appreciate being lied to. Nobody from law enforcement would be sneaking around taking pictures without identifying themselves properly." Anthony's calm demeanor started to crack slightly. "Officer, I haven't lied to you about anything. I've answered your questions and provided identification. Now, unless you have probable cause to detain me, I believe I'm free to go." Those words hit Derek like a slap in the face. Probable cause, free to go? This guy was trying to lawyer talk his way out of the situation, acting like he knew Derek's job better than Derek did. It was the kind of attitude Derek had grown to hate. People who thought they could outsmart the police with fancy words and legal terminology. "Don't tell me how to do my job," Derek snapped. "I decide when you're free to go." "Actually, officer," Anthony said, his voice remaining steady despite the tension, "the law decides that. And right now you don't have legal grounds to hold me. That was the final straw. This stranger, this outsider, was standing on Derek's turf telling him what he could and couldn't do. 8 years of dealing with people who disrespected police officers, 8 years of feeling unappreciated and criticized, all came bubbling to the surface. Derek's face flushed red with anger. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he leaned forward and spat directly into Anthony's face. The moment it happened, Derek felt a mixture of satisfaction and shock. Anthony stood there completely still as the saliva dripped down his cheek. His eyes went wide with disbelief, and for several seconds neither man moved. The street seemed to go quiet around them. A few people walking by had stopped to stare, their faces showing disgust and surprise at what they'd just witnessed. Anthony slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a tissue, wiping his face with careful, deliberate movements. His hands were steady, but Derek could see the hurt and anger in his eyes. "That was completely unnecessary," Anthony said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Derek felt a moment of uncertainty, seeing the dignity with which the man handled the humiliation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. He'd made his point, and this guy needed to understand who was in charge here. "Maybe next time you'll show some respect," Derek muttered, then turned and walked back toward his patrol car, leaving Anthony standing there on the courthouse steps. As he drove away, Derek caught a glimpse of Anthony in his rearview mirror, still standing in the same spot, still wiping his face. For just a second, Derek wondered if maybe he'd gone too far, but he pushed the thought away. Some people needed to learn the hard way that you don't mess with the police. Anthony Jackson stood motionless on the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun beating down on his shoulders. The tissue in his hand was damp with the officer's saliva, and he could still feel the humiliation burning on his cheek. In all his 20 years of law enforcement, he had never experienced anything quite like this. He had faced racism before, of course. Growing up in Detroit, then later as a young officer in Chicago, he had encountered his share of prejudice. But this was different. This was a fellow officer, someone who should have understood the badge, the oath, the commitment to serve and protect. Instead, that man had chosen to degrade him in the most primitive way possible. Anthony glanced around and noticed a few people still staring from across the street. An elderly woman shook her head in disgust before walking away. A young couple whispered to each other, their faces showing shock and disappointment. He knew they had witnessed something that would stick with them for a long time. Taking a deep breath, Anthony pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. He took a photo of himself, the courthouse visible in the background, wanting to document the moment and his location. If he decided to file a complaint, he would need evidence. The timestamp would show exactly when and where this had happened. But as he looked at his reflection in the phone's camera, he paused. His face showed the exhaustion of a man who had traveled hundreds of miles, only to be met with hatred before he had even officially started his new job. Tomorrow morning, he would be introduced as the new police chief of this small city. The irony wasn't lost on him. Anthony had accepted this position because he believed he could make a difference. The city had been looking for an experienced chief who could improve community relations and modernize their police force. His resume was impressive. 2 decades of service, multiple commendations, and a reputation for bridging gaps between law enforcement and the communities they served. The search committee had interviewed him over video calls, and he had been impressed by their commitment to change. They spoke about wanting fresh perspectives and new approaches to policing. They wanted someone who understood both sides of difficult conversations about race and justice. They had chosen him specifically because of his background and his vision for the future. Now, less than 4 hours after arriving in town, he was questioning whether he had made the right decision. Anthony walked slowly toward his rental car, his mind racing. He could call the mayor right now and tell her what had happened. He could demand that Officer Hayes be suspended immediately, before he even officially took over as chief. Any reasonable person would support him in that decision, but something held him back. Maybe it was his natural inclination to study a problem before acting, or maybe it was his curiosity about how deep these issues ran in the department. Either way, he decided to wait that evening. Anthony sat in his hotel room with his laptop open, researching Officer Derek Hayes. The department's personnel system was more outdated than he had expected, but he managed to access the basic files. What he found was troubling but not entirely surprising. Hayes had 8 years of service with what appeared to be a decent record on paper. But when Anthony dug deeper into the complaint files, a different picture emerged. Over the past 3 years, there had been 6 formal complaints against Hayes, 5 of them from Black or Hispanic citizens. The complaints ranged from excessive force to verbal abuse to unprofessional conduct. Each complaint had been investigated by the previous administration, and each had been either dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary action. The pattern was clear. Hayes had a problem with people of color, and the department had been willing to overlook it. Anthony made notes in his personal journal, something he had done throughout his career. He wrote about the encounter, about Hayes's aggression and obvious prejudice, and about the department's apparent failure to address ongoing issues. He also wrote about his own feelings, the anger, the disappointment, and the determination to use this experience as motivation for change. The next morning came quickly. Anthony had barely slept, his mind too active to rest properly. He showered, put on his new uniform for the first time, and looked at himself in the mirror. The badge felt heavier than usual, weighted with the responsibility of leading a department that clearly had serious problems. He arrived at the police station 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting. Captain Rodriguez, the interim chief, greeted him warmly and showed him around the building. The facility was older than Anthony had expected, but well-maintained. The officers he met seemed professional, though he noticed a few curious glances at his rank insignia. "The whole department is excited to meet you," Rodriguez said as they walked toward the main conference room. "We've been looking forward to having permanent leadership again." Anthony nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Somewhere in this building was Officer Hayes, probably getting ready for the same meeting, probably having no idea what was about to happen. As they entered the conference room, Anthony saw about 40 officers gathered in rows of chairs. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, and he could sense anticipation in the air. Some officers looked genuinely excited, while others seemed more cautious, probably wondering what changes a new chief might bring. Captain Rodriguez walked to the front of the room and called for attention. The conversations died down quickly, and all eyes turned toward the front. "Good morning, everyone," Rodriguez began. "As you all know, we're here for a very special occasion. After months of searching, the city has selected our new police chief. I've had the pleasure of working with him this morning, and I can already tell that we're in good hands." Anthony scanned the room, looking for Hayes. He found him in the 3rd row, sitting up straight in his chair, looking confident and relaxed. Hayes was nodding along with Rodriguez's words, apparently pleased with the idea of new leadership. "Our new chief comes to us from Chicago, where he spent 20 years rising through the ranks," Rodriguez continued. "He has extensive experience in community policing, crisis management, and department modernization. He's exactly what we need to move our department forward." Hayes was still nodding, even smiling slightly. Anthony wondered what was going through the man's mind. Was he thinking about yesterday's encounter? Did he even remember the face of the man he had humiliated on the courthouse steps? "Please join me in welcoming Chief Anthony Jackson," Rodriguez announced, gesturing toward the back of the room where Anthony stood. The room erupted in applause as Anthony began walking toward the front. He kept his expression neutral, professional, but his eyes found Hayes immediately. He watched as recognition dawned on the officer's face as the confident smile disappeared, as the color drained from his cheeks. Hayes's mouth fell open slightly, and his hand stopped clapping. Other officers near him continued applauding, unaware of the drama unfolding in their colleague's mind. Hayes looked like he had seen a ghost, or perhaps like he was realizing that his worst nightmare had just come true. Anthony reached the front of the room and turned to face the assembled officers. The applause died down and silence fell over the room. He could feel Hayes staring at him, could sense the man's panic and fear. "Thank you," Anthony said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm honored to be here, and I look forward to working with each and every one of you." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before settling briefly on Hayes. The officer looked like he might be sick. "I believe in leading by example," Anthony continued. "I believe in accountability, fairness, and treating every member of our community with dignity and respect. These aren't just words to me. They're the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement officers." Several officers nodded in agreement, but Hayes remained frozen in his chair. Anthony had planned to give a longer speech, to talk about his vision for the department and his plans for the future, but seeing Hayes sitting there looking terrified and guilty, He decided to keep it short. "I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the coming weeks," he said. "I want to learn from your experience and hear your ideas for how we can better serve our community. Together we're going to build something special here." The applause returned, though it seemed more subdued now. Anthony thanked everyone and began shaking hands with officers as they filed out of the room. He watched Hayes from the corner of his eye, noting how the man seemed to be trying to blend in with the crowd and escape without being noticed. But Anthony had no intention of letting that happen. Not yet, anyway. He had some thinking to do first. The next 3 days passed like a strange dance. Anthony settled into his new office, meeting with department heads and reviewing policies while Derek Hayes seemed to vanish into the background. Anthony would catch glimpses of him in the hallways, always hurrying somewhere else, always avoiding eye contact. Anthony spent those first days learning about his new department. What he discovered was both encouraging and troubling. Many of the officers were dedicated professionals who genuinely cared about their community. They were hard-working people who took pride in their jobs and wanted to make a difference. But there were also signs of deeper problems. The training records were outdated. Community complaint procedures were confusing and hard to navigate. Most telling of all, there seemed to be an unofficial culture of protecting officers from consequences, even when those consequences were deserved. During his meetings with various supervisors, Anthony began to understand how Hayes had been able to continue his pattern of behavior for so long. When complaints came in, they were often dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Officers vouched for each other even when they knew better. The previous leadership had prioritized department unity over accountability. On Wednesday afternoon, Anthony was reviewing personnel files when his assistant knocked on his door. "Chief, there's someone here to see you. Mrs. Patterson from the community center." An elderly black woman entered his office, moving slowly but with purpose. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent decades fighting for justice in small but important ways. "Chief Jackson," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I wanted to welcome you to our city and to thank you for taking this job. We've been praying for someone like you for a long time." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I appreciate your support." She studied his face carefully, as if trying to read something there. "I heard about what happened on Tuesday. At the courthouse." Anthony felt his stomach tighten. He had wondered if word would get out, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. "What did you hear?" "My granddaughter was walking by when that officer spit in your face," she said quietly. "She called me right away, upset and angry. Said she couldn't believe what she had seen." Anthony leaned back in his chair, processing this information. He had hoped to handle the situation quietly, internally, but now he realized that keeping it quiet might not be possible, and maybe it shouldn't be. "She recognized you from the newspaper photo," Mrs. Patterson continued. "The one they ran when you were hired. She put 2 and 2 together and realized who you were." She paused, shaking her head. That officer had no idea he was attacking his new boss. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate you coming to tell me this, but I need to handle this situation carefully." She held up her hand, stopping him. "Chief, I've lived in this city for 73 years. I've seen a lot of things, some good and some terrible, and I'm going to tell you something that might help you understand what you're dealing with here." Anthony nodded for her to continue. "Officer Hayes isn't the worst we've had, but he's not the best either. He's got a problem with people who look like you and me, and everybody knows it. But he's also got friends in this department who cover for him. The previous chief was one of them." This confirmed what Anthony had suspected from reviewing the files. "How bad has it been?" "Bad enough that most of us stopped reporting things. What's the point of filing a complaint when nothing happens? When they tell you that you must have misunderstood what happened?" She leaned forward in her chair. "But now we have hope again. Now we have someone who might actually listen." After Mrs. Patterson left, Anthony sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the courthouse where everything had started. He could see the exact spot where Hayes had humiliated him, where his new job had become infinitely more complicated than he had expected. He picked up his phone and dialed the mayor's number. "Helen, it's Anthony. We need to talk." Mayor Helen Walsh had been one of his strongest supporters during the hiring process. She was a progressive leader who had campaigned on police reform and had specifically recruited Anthony to help implement those changes. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Anthony told her everything. The encounter with Hayes, the complaint history he had discovered, and his conversation with Mrs. Patterson. He spoke carefully, sticking to facts and avoiding emotional language, but he could hear her sharp intake of breath when he described being spat upon. "Anthony, I am so sorry. This is exactly the kind of behavior we hired you to address, but I never imagined you would face it personally, and certainly not on your first day in town. Helen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know about Hayes's history when you hired me?" There was a long pause. "We knew there had been complaints, yes, but the previous administration assured us they had been handled appropriately. We trusted their judgment, which was clearly a mistake." Anthony felt a flash of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "So you brought me here to fix problems that you didn't fully disclose to me?" "We brought you here because we knew you were the right person to handle exactly these kinds of situations. Anthony, I'm not going to lie to you. This department has issues. But that's why we need you. That's why we were willing to pay you more than the previous chief. Why we gave you a 5-year contract with full authority to make changes." Anthony understood the position he was in. The city leaders knew they had problems, but they hadn't wanted to scare away their top candidate by being completely transparent about how bad things were. Now he was here, and backing out would only make everything worse. "What do you want me to do about Hayes?" he asked. "That's entirely up to you. You have my full support, whatever you decide. Fire him, suspend him, retrain him. It's your call. Just know that whatever action you take, some people in the department and in the community are going to be watching very closely." That evening, Anthony drove through the city, familiarizing himself with different neighborhoods and getting a feel for the place he now called home. He noticed things he hadn't seen during his interview visits: the subtle but clear economic and racial divisions, the areas where police presence was heavy, and the areas where it was light, the community centers and churches that seemed to serve as anchors for their neighborhoods. He stopped at a small diner for dinner and found himself in conversation with the owner, a middle-aged white man named Frank, who had run the place for 15 years. "You're the new police chief, right?" Frank asked, refilling Anthony's coffee cup. "Saw your picture in the paper." "That's right." Frank glanced around the mostly empty restaurant and lowered his voice. "Can I tell you something? Most of the cops who come in here are good people. They work hard, they treat customers with respect, they tip well. But there are a few," he shook his head, "a few who make you wonder if they should be wearing a badge." Anthony waited for him to continue. "There's this one officer, Hayes. Young guy, been around for a while. He came in here about 6 months ago with his partner, and they were talking about some arrest they had made. The way Hayes was describing this black kid they had picked up." Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say it wasn't professional." His partner looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. Anthony nodded, adding this information to the growing picture he was developing of Derek Hayes. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble for anybody," Frank continued, "but I've lived in this town my whole life, and I can tell when someone's got hate in their heart. That's what I saw in that officer." Driving home to his temporary apartment, Anthony made his decision. He wouldn't fire Hayes immediately, as satisfying as that might feel. Instead, he would do something that might be even more difficult for both of them. He would try to understand what had created this situation and whether it could be fixed. The next morning, Anthony sent a message through the department's internal system, requesting that Officer Hayes report to his office at 2 p.m. He didn't explain why, and he didn't copy anyone else on the message. He wanted this first conversation to be private. At exactly 2 p.m., there was a hesitant knock on his door. "Come in," Anthony called out. Derek Hayes entered the office looking like a man walking to his own execution. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge polished to a shine, but his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" Anthony gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat, Officer Hayes." Derek sat down carefully, perched on the edge of the chair as if ready to run at any moment. The two men looked at each other across the desk, and Anthony could see fear, shame, and defiance warring in the younger man's eyes. "I think," Anthony said quietly, "we need to have a conversation." Derek Hayes sat in the chair like a statue, his back rigid and his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The silence in Chief Jackson's office stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. Derek's mind raced through different scenarios, denials, excuses, apologies, but none of them seemed adequate for what he had done. "Officer Hayes," Chief Jackson began, his voice calm but serious. Do you know why you're here? Derek's throat felt dry. He opened his mouth to speak but only managed to croak out a barely audible yes, sir. Good. That saves us both some time. The chief leaned forward slightly. What I want to understand is why. Why did you approach me on Tuesday? Why did you become aggressive? And why did you think it was acceptable to spit in my face? Each question hit Derek like a physical blow. He had spent the last 3 days trying to forget what had happened, trying to convince himself that maybe the new chief hadn't recognized him, that maybe he could pretend it never occurred. But sitting here now, facing the man he had humiliated, all those hopes crumbled. I thought you looked suspicious, Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. Suspicious how? Derek struggled to find words that didn't sound racist, but everything he came up with seemed to make it worse. You were taking pictures of the courthouse. I thought maybe you were planning something. Chief Jackson nodded slowly. I see. And when I explained that I was there for work purposes, why didn't you believe me? You wouldn't tell me what kind of work. You were being evasive, was I? Or was I simply trying to keep my new position confidential until the official announcement? The chief's voice remained steady, but Derek could hear the controlled anger underneath. Tell me, Officer Hayes, in your 8 years on the force, how many white men have you stopped for taking pictures of buildings? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Derek knew the answer, and he knew the chief knew it too. He had never stopped a white person for photography, not once. The realization made his stomach turn. I can't recall any specific incidents, Derek said weakly. But you can recall stopping Black and Hispanic people for similar activities. I've reviewed your reports. Derek felt the walls closing in around him. Every excuse he had prepared sounded hollow and pathetic in his own mind. The truth was ugly and shameful, but it was becoming impossible to avoid. Chief, I know what I did was wrong. I know it looked bad. Looked bad. Chief Jackson's composure cracked slightly. Officer Hayes, you assaulted a fellow law enforcement officer, based solely on the color of his skin. This isn't about appearances. This is about your fitness to wear a badge. Derek felt tears welling up in his eyes, which made him angry at himself. He didn't want to cry in front of his new boss, especially not after what he had done. But the weight of his actions, the shame and fear he had been carrying for 3 days, was becoming overwhelming. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Chief Jackson opened a folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. Let me help you understand the situation you're in, Officer Hayes. This folder contains records of 6 complaints filed against you over the past 3 years. 5 of those complaints came from people of color. 4 involved allegations of verbal abuse or excessive force. 2 included witness statements describing clearly racist language on your part. Derek's face burned with shame. He had hoped those incidents would stay buried in the files forever. Each of these complaints was investigated by the previous administration and dismissed or minimized, but I'm not the previous administration. Chief Jackson set the papers down and looked directly at Derek. What happened on Tuesday wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of behavior that should have been addressed years ago. Chief, I've been under a lot of stress lately. My divorce, money problems, I'm not making excuses, but no, you're right. You're not making excuses because there is no excuse for what you did. Chief Jackson stood up and walked to the window. Officer Hayes, I could fire you right now. I could have you arrested and charged with assault. I could make sure you never work in law enforcement again. Derek's heart stopped. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way that terrified him. But, the chief continued, turning back to face him, I'm not going to do that. Not yet, anyway. Derek looked up in surprise. Sir, I'm going to give you a choice. Officer Hayes, a one-time opportunity to address your behavior and become the officer you should have been all along. Chief Jackson returned to his desk and pulled out another folder. Here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to write a detailed report of Tuesday's incident. No lies, no minimizing. Just the truth about what you did and why you did it. That report will become part of your permanent record. Derek nodded, afraid to speak. Second, you're going to undergo 40 hours of cultural sensitivity training with a program in the state capitol. It's intensive. It's designed for law enforcement officers with exactly your issues. And it's not optional. Yes, sir. Third, you're going to spend 60 hours doing community service with organizations that serve the communities you've been harassing. The African American Community Center, the Hispanic Cultural Association, and the Youth Mentorship Program. You'll work directly with the people you've been treating as enemies. Derek felt his stomach churn. The idea of facing the very communities he had wronged was terrifying. Fourth, you're going to meet with me every 2 weeks for the next 6 months. We're going to discuss your progress, your attitudes, and your fitness to continue as a police officer. Chief Jackson paused, letting the weight of these requirements sink in. And finally, he said, his voice becoming even more serious, you're going to publicly apologize to me and to this community for your actions. Not just Tuesday's incident, but for the pattern of behavior that led to it. Derek's mind reeled. The public apology was almost worse than being fired. Everyone would know what he had done. His fellow officers, his friends, his family, they would all see him admit to being a racist. I know what you're thinking, Chief Jackson said. You're thinking that admitting to this publicly will ruin your reputation, your career, your life. But let me ask you something. What kind of reputation do you think you have now? What kind of career do you think you'll have if nothing changes? Derek had no answer for that. Officer Hayes, I'm offering you something precious, a chance to change, to become better than you are right now. Most people who do what you did never get that opportunity. They get fired, they get prosecuted, they move on to other jobs in other places where they continue the same patterns. The chief sat down again and leaned forward. But change is hard work. It requires you to face uncomfortable truths about yourself and your beliefs. It requires you to admit that you've been wrong, not just about Tuesday, but about a lot of things. Are you willing to do that work? Derek sat in silence for a long moment, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain his dignity and face whatever consequences came. But a larger part of him was exhausted by the hate and anger he'd been carrying around for years. He was tired of being the kind of person who could spit in another human being's face. What if I can't do it? He asked quietly. What if I try and I fail? Then you fail honestly, which is better than not trying at all. But I don't think you'll fail if you commit to the process. Why? Derek asked. Why are you giving me this chance? After what I did to you, why don't you just fire me? Chief Jackson was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because firing you doesn't solve the problem, Officer Hayes. It just moves the problem somewhere else. If you can change, if you can become an example of what's possible when someone confronts their own prejudices, then maybe other officers will see that and change too. Derek felt something shift inside him, a small crack in the wall of anger and defensiveness he had built around himself. For the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope. I'll do it, he said, his voice stronger than it had been since entering the office. I'll do whatever you ask me to do. Chief Jackson nodded. Good. We'll start with the report. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. And Officer Hayes? Yes, sir? This is your last chance. If you violate any part of this agreement, if you show any signs of returning to your old patterns, I will end your career without hesitation. Do you understand? I understand, Chief, and thank you. As Derek left the office, he felt like a different person than the one who had entered. He was scared, ashamed, and uncertain about the future. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't angry. That anger had been poisoning him for years, turning him into someone he didn't want to be. Now he had a chance to become someone better. The question was whether he was strong enough to take it. 6 months later, the community center was packed with people. Local residents, city officials, police officers, and media representatives filled every available seat. Derek Hayes stood backstage, his hands trembling as he reviewed his notes one final time. In just a few minutes, he would walk out onto that stage and do something he never thought possible. Tell the truth about who he had been and who he was trying to become. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first weeks of community service had been brutal. Derek had shown up at the African American Community Center, expecting to be met with hostility and anger, and in some cases he was right. But what surprised him was the patience and grace that many people showed him, even after learning what he had done. Mrs. Patterson had been his assigned supervisor at the center. The same woman who had visited Chief Jackson's office was now responsible for overseeing Derek's rehabilitation. At first, their interactions were cold and formal. She gave him tasks, cleaning, organizing, helping with after-school programs, and he completed them in silence. But gradually, something began to change. Derek started listening to the conversations around him, really listening for the first time in his life. He heard parents talking about their fears when their teenage sons went out at night. He heard grandmothers sharing stories about encounters with police that left them feeling humiliated and helpless. He heard children asking innocent questions about why some officers seemed angry all the time. One afternoon, while helping with a youth mentorship program, Derek found himself paired with a 12-year-old boy named Kevin. The kid was smart and curious, full of questions about everything from basketball to space exploration. But when Derek mentioned that he was a police officer, Kevin's entire demeanor changed. "Are you one of the mean ones?" Kevin asked quietly. The question hit Derek like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "My cousin says there are two kinds of police officers. The ones who help people and the mean ones who hurt people just because they're black. Which one are you?" Derek had no answer. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that you used to be one of the mean ones, but you're trying to change? How do you tell a child that adults sometimes let their fears and prejudices turn them into monsters? That night, Derek went home and called his ex-wife for the first time since their divorce. She was surprised to hear from him and even more surprised when he apologized for the anger and bitterness he had brought into their marriage. "I blamed you for everything," he told her. "I blamed my job. I blamed the community. I blamed everyone except the person who was really responsible. Me. I'm sorry, Linda. I'm sorry for the man I became and the way I treated you." She cried on the phone, telling him she had been waiting for years to hear those words. The cultural sensitivity training had been equally challenging. Derek found himself in a room with other law enforcement officers who had similar issues, forced to confront the ugly reality of his own beliefs and behaviors. The instructors didn't coddle them or make excuses for them. They presented hard truths about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the history of policing in America. For the first time, Derek began to understand how his actions affected real people's lives. He learned about the psychological impact of being constantly viewed with suspicion, the trauma that comes from being treated as a threat simply for existing, the way that small acts of prejudice can accumulate into something devastating. During one particularly difficult session, Derek broke down completely. All the guilt and shame he had been carrying came pouring out as he described what he had done to Chief Jackson. The other officers in the group listened without judgment, many of them sharing their own stories of moments they weren't proud of. "The hardest part," Derek said through his tears, "is realizing that I became exactly the kind of person I used to hate when I was a kid. My own father was a racist and I swore I'd never be like him. But somewhere along the way I became worse than he ever was." His bi-weekly meetings with Chief Jackson evolved over time. What started as formal check-ins became genuine conversations about policing, community relations, and personal growth. Chief Jackson shared his own experiences with racism, both as a citizen and as an officer. He talked about the challenges of being a black man in law enforcement, the pressure to prove himself constantly, the weight of representing his entire race in predominantly white departments. "The difference between us," Chief Jackson told Derek during one of their meetings, "isn't that I never felt anger or frustration. It's that I learned to channel those feelings into something constructive instead of destructive." Derek began to see his chief not just as an authority figure but as a mentor and eventually as something approaching a friend. Chief Jackson pushed him to examine his assumptions, challenged him to think differently about his role in the community, and held him accountable for his progress. The changes in Derek became noticeable to his fellow officers. He stopped participating in the casual racist jokes that were common in the break room. He began questioning procedures and policies that seemed to disproportionately affect minority communities. Some of his colleagues were supportive, recognizing that he was trying to become a better person. Others were less understanding, viewing his transformation as a betrayal of their unspoken code. Officer Rodriguez, Derek's former partner, pulled him aside one day after Derek had challenged a comment about those people in a particular neighborhood. "What's gotten into you, man?" Rodriguez asked. "Ever since you came back from that training, you've been acting different. Like you're better than the rest of us or something." "I'm not better than anyone," Derek replied. "I'm just trying to be better than I used to be." The community work continued to open Derek's eyes. He helped organize a neighborhood cleanup in an area he had previously viewed only as a source of crime and problems. Working alongside residents, he began to see the pride people took in their homes and their determination to create safe spaces for their children, despite limited resources. At the Hispanic Cultural Association, Derek learned basic Spanish and helped with citizenship classes. He met families who had been in the country for generations and others who were recent immigrants, all working hard to build better lives for their children. He began to understand the fear that undocumented residents lived with every day, and how his uniform represented the possibility of separation and deportation. Mrs. Patterson eventually warmed up to Derek, though she never let him forget the work he still needed to do. One day, while they were organizing donated clothes for a back-to-school drive, she asked him a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Derek, what do you think changed you? What made you realize you needed to be different?" Derek thought about it for a long time before answering. "I think it was seeing myself through Chief Jackson's eyes, not just the anger or disappointment, but the sadness. He looked at me like I was someone who had lost his way, not someone who was inherently evil. That gave me hope that maybe I could find my way back." Now, standing backstage at the community center, Derek reflected on all the moments that had led him here, the training sessions that had shattered his worldview, the community service that had shown him the humanity in people he had previously dehumanized, the conversations with Chief Jackson that had challenged him to be better. Chief Jackson appeared beside him, adjusting his own tie as he prepared to introduce Derek to the audience. "You ready for this?" the chief asked. Derek took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. Chief, before we go out there, I need to say something." "What's that?" "Thank you. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For giving me a chance when you had every right to destroy my career. I know I can never undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that it changed my life." Chief Jackson placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. "You changed your own life, Derek. I just provided the opportunity. Now come on. Let's go show this community what transformation looks like." They walked onto the stage together, the former victim and the former perpetrator, now united in a mission to heal their community and prevent others from walking the path Derek had once traveled. Derek approached the podium, looked out at the packed auditorium, and began to speak. "6 months ago, I was a different person," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "I was angry, bitter, and filled with prejudices that I refused to acknowledge. I treated people in this community as enemies instead of neighbors. I abused my authority and betrayed the oath I had taken to serve and protect." He paused, seeing familiar faces in the audience. Mrs. Patterson, Kevin from the youth program, families he had worked with during his community service. "I can't change what I did," Derek continued. "I can't take back the hurt I caused or the trust I broke. But I can tell you what I've learned, and I can promise you that the person who stands before you today is not the same person who wore this badge 6 months ago." As Derek continued his speech, talking about his journey from hatred to understanding, Chief Jackson watched from the side of the stage. In the audience, he could see people leaning forward, listening intently to this extraordinary confession and transformation. It hadn't been easy, and there would be more work to do. But looking at Derek now, speaking honestly about his failures and his growth, Chief Jackson felt something he hadn't expected when he first took this job: hope. The changes in Derek had rippled through the entire department. Other officers had begun examining their own biases, asking harder questions about their interactions with the community. Training programs had been expanded, policies had been updated, and most importantly, a culture of accountability was beginning to take root. As Derek finished his speech to thunderous applause, Chief Jackson realized that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from punishment, but from the courage to transform hatred into understanding, one person at a time.